was trying to keep the social distance, Dave, so do the right thing. It's not just that I didn't want to get close to you. Well, it's so nice to be here with some of you in the building and to also join with you virtually if you're watching on the screen. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be invited to speak at your church anniversary. And thank you for your welcome. Well, with Dave leading at the start of the service, we've already been looking back this morning, back to 1827, over that 194 years of church history. Anniversaries, whether they're of a church or wedding or any other sort, are traditionally a time for both looking back and for looking forward. And I guess most of us would say it's good to look back and remember our story, to think about where we've come from, what God has done in the past. And yet I want to begin with a question. Should we be doing so? Should we be spending time looking back at what is gone, things that we can't change or even influence in the slightest? Well, there are plenty of scriptures that would answer my questions with a resounding yes. For example, Deuteronomy 32 and verse 7, part of the Song of Moses, just before the people of God entered the promised land. That verse says this: remember the days of old, consider the generations long past. Ask your father, and he will tell you, your elders, and they will explain to you. Or, of course, the Last Supper we're going to be sharing in communion later. The Last Supper is recorded in Luke 22 and verse 19. At that feast, Jesus took bread, gave thanks and broke it and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me," or simply, do this to remember me. These scriptures and others besides encourage us to look back and remember what God has done in the past, specifically his mighty acts of deliverance. And yet, before jumping to a hasty conclusion on the matter, listen to God's word to his people at one point through the prophet Isaiah. This is Isaiah 43 and verse 18. Forget the former things. Do not dwell on the past. So which are we supposed to do? Remember the past or forget it? Well, I believe to answer, we need to dig a little deeper and realize not only that these instructions are given at different times in different contexts, but they're also talking about different kinds of remembering. The kind of remembering that God has always encouraged among his people is remembrance in order to reflect on God's greatness and faithfulness, and therefore to trust him for the future, however challenging or uncertain it may appear. The kind of remembering that his people were indulging in during Isaiah's time was a wistful one, a remembering through rose-tinted spectacles. The people were angry with God for the challenges that they faced, and they were remembering the good old days that they'd enjoyed. They weren't looking to the future with trust in God, but wishing that they were back in some imaginary halcyon day. They were dwelling on the past. And it's not the first time that God's people had done so. I think that their words recorded in Numbers chapter 11 are deeply ironic. At that point, God had just led them through the Red Sea. And through miracle upon miracle, he was providing for their needs, manna to eat in the middle of a desert, guidance through an unknown land, and victory over their enemies. And what do they remember? We remember the fish we ate in Egypt at no cost. Also the cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic. But now we have lost our appetite. We never see anything but this manna. They were grumbling. They had completely forgotten that the fish and the other delicacies that they ate were actually not at no cost. They had paid for them many times over through their enforced labour. God had graciously and miraculously released them from slavery. Their memory was highly selective. Looking back to the past filled them with bitterness and resentment, instead of equipping them and inspiring them to face the future. Can God's people today ever fall into similar bad habits of poor remembrance, of dwelling in the past? Well, I'll leave you to judge. It's possible you've heard comments something like, under our previous leadership, we had a Sunday school of hundreds. When such comments are made, are they being said from a heart that is rejoicing and believing that God can do an equally wonderful new thing among the upcoming generation? Or are they being said with grumbling and a desire to be back in a very different day? Yes, we can and should learn lessons from history, including our own story. But we shouldn't dwell in the past. It's a bit like using the rear view mirror when you are driving. An occasional glance can tell you useful things about what's behind. But if you take your eyes off what is in front of you for too long and dwell in the rear view mirror, you're going to end up in huge difficulty. So how should we look forward, look to the future? Well, the truth is that right now, the future is incredibly uncertain for everyone. As we think of the possibility of a post-pandemic world, there's much talk of a new normal. That expression recognizes that things will never be the same. In the world of work, I very much doubt we will ever see the same numbers commuting to city offices because of the increase in home working. But it's not just in the world out there. Church, too, will have a new normal. Church will be different. Perhaps the pandemic has simply accelerated changes that would have happened anyway. The truth is that we all find change uncomfortable to some extent or other. Are we looking to the new future of church with a sense of fear and dread, or with hope and trust in God? Listen now to the verse in Isaiah that follows the do not dwell in the past one. So moving on to verse 19 of Isaiah 43. God says, "See, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it? I'm making a way in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland." God is a creative God. He's more than capable of reinventing church so that it is fit for the 21st century, for post-pandemic Britain. We have no need to fear his new thing. What we should be wary of is jumping on the latest bandwagon or coming up with our own solutions and way forward. And we should be very wary of stubbornly resisting God's new ways simply out of fear. Will we trust God to lead us forward because of the great things he has done in the past? Or are we going to dwell on a bygone day when church was very different because our community, our mission field was very different? I can't stand here this morning and tell you every detail of God's new way for Westmoreland Baptist Church, but I can share my heart, which I hope is shaped by God. One change I long to see is for congregations to find better, more effective ways of connecting to the 95% of our population who never go to church. To find new ways of communicating with them and connecting them to the loving and unchanging God. So in the remainder of our time this morning, I simply want to share some general principles to explore as we might work out what God's new ways might involve. And the first I'd suggest is that future church should focus more on being than doing. Before anything else, God calls us to be his children, to know that we are loved, to know that we're accepted and forgiven. And that is a wonderful privilege to be cherished and enjoyed. And it's as we live as children of God every moment of every day that we become the true expression of church. Men and women who believe the gospel and live by it. It sounds so simple, but the reality is that it is incredibly tough. It means that our faith is not merely a hobby, something that we give a couple of hours to on a Sunday morning. This is not an optional extra for those really keen Christians, but it's something that happens when Jesus, following Jesus, becomes the very center of our lives. It defines who we are. I would suggest that the most powerful, effective ingredient for church growth is not the right course or the best activity, but ordinary men and women who are 100% defined by Jesus, who totally get the grace that they've been shown at the cross, who've been transformed by the love and forgiveness that they have freely received, who can't help sharing Jesus because they are salt and light. It is about remembering the great acts of deliverance that God has done in our lives and forgetting the cucumbers and onions. This is not saying that we've got to lock ourselves away until by some supreme effort we have become perfect. That's never going to happen. It's about receiving God's grace by his Holy Spirit, being baptized in it so that it fills us and overflows to others. Rather than locking ourselves away, this is very much about living out our faith in the community around us. And that leads me to the second focus I would suggest for future church. And that is going out rather than inviting in. Now, whether we've ever stopped to think about it or not, whether we would agree with it, if we had, the vast majority of churches have operated an attractional model of evangelism or church growth for generations. Now, it's not necessarily all one thing or all the other, But I do believe there needs to be a shift away from inviting people to come to church towards taking church out to them. Many of us are familiar, very familiar, with attempting to set up the best church service or activity that we can imagine and waiting for people to be attracted to it and thereby find faith. The major problem with that model is that we're effectively asking people to join us with a setup that we are familiar with and comfortable with, rather than what is familiar to them. We're imposing our terms rather than going onto their territory. And whilst by God's grace the attractional model does still work for a few, especially among those with some previous church experience, the truth is it isn't very effective for the vast majority of today who have little or no knowledge of what goes on inside a typical church building. To illustrate what I mean, when I moved to Essex, I know it's the other side of the water, that heathen place, when I moved to Essex 9 years ago to become minister of Westcliff Baptist Church, I joined a running club, in part because I'm one of those weird people who likes running, and the further the better, but also because I wanted to be an example to church members of how to witness, in effect, how to attract non-Christians to church. But in my entire 7.5 years of ministry in Westcliff, not one of my running club came to a Sunday service at the church. Was that because I was chicken and never mentioned my faith? No, I did talk to a good number about Jesus, and I prayed with some of them. But coming to church was never on their radar. They couldn't imagine why they would ever want to do so. But at one point, the church decided to do some litter picks as an act of worship to demonstrate God's care for God's creation and care for the local community. One of my running friends, Elisha, was and is very concerned for the environment. She'd already organised some of her own litter picks. She helped me to get things organised. She volunteered to come along and join us, not worshipping by singing songs on a Sunday morning, but worshipping by caring for creation in the afternoon. Something was very different. Talk of God now made a connection with her. And going out rather than inviting in has another advantage, that of visibility. Another thing we did as a church in Westcliff was to set up what we called a community discussion group. There is a lovely independent coffee shop in Westcliff run by a German lady called Anke. And on Sunday afternoon, once a month, a group of us would go to Anke's, enjoy some delicious cake, coffee and tea and whatever else, and simply discuss matters of life and faith. And in many senses, we could have had just as good discussions in the church. The difference is that no one would have noticed. No one would have known. Whereas in the coffee shop, there were always people passing and some would join in. One was an elderly Jewish gentleman called Harold, who simply came up one month and said, "Can I tell you a joke?" Before I could reply and perhaps check what kind of joke he had in mind, he continued, "What makes God laugh?" I was really getting worried at this point, I can tell you. The punchline he gave was, "When we tell him what we're going to do tomorrow." I can tell you that led to a profound conversation. Over months, we got to know Harold, and he would often join in. Now, I'm well aware that in one sense, there's nothing new in this. The church has always gone to where people are. But we've tended to do so as a project, as evangelism, as mission. The aim has generally been that as soon as people come to faith, we pluck them out of their environment and bring them to us. Well, this is a challenge to think of another step, to leave them in their environment, but to see how church could emerge there, seeing people grow and be discipled where they are, taking church to others and allowing it to emerge where they are does necessitate rethinking what church is. It is risky. We may have to get past thinking of church as a building. We may have to get past thinking of it as an institution, a structure, a club, or a Sunday service even. The pictures the Bible gives of church are very different from those things. They are relational, the body, the vine and the branches, the family, and so on. And they are Jesus-centered. He is the head of the body. He is the vine to which we are connected. Jesus must be apparent, visible. My third suggestion to explore for future church is to be more relationship-based and less rule-based. For example, consider a church in which a new member evidently has a problem with excessive drinking of alcohol. In a rule-based church, concern may be expressed as to whether this new member should be baptized or whether their membership should be suspended until they have sorted this problem. Comments might be made about the poor example it will set the youth in the church and so on. In a relationship-based church, more mature members will look to see whether there's a reason for the new member's destructive behaviour, perhaps something like the experience of a major life catastrophe. They will model taking such matters to Jesus rather than focusing on upholding standards and imposing rules. And let me say, this is not about moral laxity. Our example is Jesus, the one who never sinned. But people fell in love with Jesus because he loved them first. He was accepting and inclusive rather than judgmental. Building church on relationship rather than rules means loving others first, however different from us they may be or however differently they may behave. When we truly start doing that, we may find we start to connect with those individuals who would be very unlikely to step into a traditional church building. Just before I close, I want to raise one final question. If we are bold enough to strip away our traditions and some of the things that we find comfortable and familiar, what are we left with? What are the essential activities that are absolutely indispensable in future church? Well, it's not the only passage to which I could refer, so I won't claim it gives an exclusive guide to how church should be organised. But Acts 2 and verse 42 gives a simple picture of the early church. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Just 4 elements: teaching, fellowship, meals together, including the Lord's Supper, and prayer. And those 4 elements led to the following result recorded in verse 47. the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. As you gradually come out of the restrictions of lockdown, you will need to care for one another, and you'll need to grapple with the practical issues of restarting various groups and activities. In the midst of that process, my challenge is to think about new areas, not so much another activity to cram into an already busy schedule, but rather how you can be church out there more. Start with who you are, what experience, interests, contacts you already have. If you regularly go to the gym or the pub or a quilting group or whatever, how can you live out your faith more effectively in those places? And rather than stress about how you could possibly invite those people to church, ask what church might look like among that group of people. Be open as God leads to take church, and more importantly, Christ, out to your community. I hope you found those words helpful. Before I hand back to Dave and we get on to communion, let's just pause and give opportunity for God perhaps to take away stuff that's just been of me and just to confirm his word to our hearts. Let's just take a moment to reflect and to respond to God, to say yes to whatever prompt he might be giving us personally this morning. Lord Jesus, whenever we think about change, we all get uncomfortable. We like what we know and what we're familiar with. But Lord, help us to look back on what you have done, what we've seen you do and achieve through Westmoreland Baptist Church in the past. And help us to gain trust and inspiration from those things, to enable us to look forward to the future that you would lead us into. Lord, with confidence that you will keep us safe, that you will lead us in productive and effective ways, that you will enable us to be your people, your church, in this time and in the days ahead. Amen.